I'm Charlotte McLeod with the Investing News Network, and here today with me is Jumana Saleheen, Chief Economist at CRU Group. We're speaking during the week of PDAC, where Jumana gave a presentation on the decade after COVID-19 and how the changes it's caused could impact the mining industry. That's a pretty big topic, so let's start with COVID-19. Jumana, where would you say we're at globally in terms of a recovery?
So following the big downturn that we saw in 2020, global output fell by just under 4%, but the recovery has started, and we expect in 2021 to see a strong rebound of around 6%. But I want to stress that the recovery is actually taking place at different paces in different regions. So for example, China, it was one of the first countries into the crisis, first countries out of the crisis. So actually that's ahead in terms of the recovery. The US is following on the tracks, and with a bit of a lag is Europe, where the recovery has been slower.
As the COVID-19 situation improves, I've been hearing more and more comments about a green recovery. Can you explain what that means and what policies are being put in place around the world to incentivize this transition?
Yeah, good question. Green recovery essentially means when the government provides any form of stimulus, that they try to use that stimulus to also meet their ambitions of climate change. So with one stone, which is stimulus, they're able to hit two birds. One is the recovery and one is climate. So that's essentially what a green recovery is. Now, of course, they can't have every single bit of their stimulus plan to be green. They can't ask for that. And why is that? If we think about stimulus for the vaccine rollout, they're spending money. In the US, they're spending quite a lot of money on that. Similarly, in Europe, that is not going to be green. It's going to be kind of more on the pandemic relief side. But for example, in Europe, they have said that 30% of their EU Green Recovery Fund will go to green aspects. So whether that's building electric vehicle charging stations or installing other processes that allow for renewable energy, it can vary a lot.
Assuming the world does start to move on from COVID-19 in a more environmentally friendly way, what does that mean for resources? What commodities might thrive in a low carbon economy and which ones might fall out of favor?
So commodities such as copper, aluminium, and nickel, which are often labeled as green commodities, are the commodities that we need to build the infrastructure that will support a low carbon economy. And what I mean by that is things like solar panels, wind turbines, electric vehicle charging stations. Those are the commodities that are likely to thrive. In terms of the commodities that are likely to fall out of favor, they are the fossil fuel commodities, namely coal, gas, and oil, which tend to be high emission commodities.
On a similar note, to what extent do you think renewable resources like wind and solar will play a role in the energy mix versus non-renewables like fossil fuels?
So renewables energy is actually already starting to play quite a vital role. So for example, in 2020, estimates suggest that it was about 30% of the energy mix, and that was up about 6 to 7 percentage points over the last decade. So it's been rising. However, we need to do more of that. We need to have that transition at a faster pace, and experts such as climate experts have said that we need to see the renewable share rise to something like 50% over the next decade. So quite a lot of challenges going ahead.
Emissions reduction is, of course, a key part of a low carbon economy. But before we dive into that, can you give me a sense of the challenge we're looking at here? Where are emissions now, and where would they ideally be as we move forward over the next decade?
So emissions now are at a pretty high level, around 52, 53 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions. That's based on numbers that were released in 2019. We know that in 2020, emissions levels fell quite dramatically as economies were shut down. But since they've opened up, the emission levels have risen again. So we're still similarly at broadly similar levels of emissions. in terms of around 50 to 53 gigatons of emissions. Where do we have to go from there? So experts such as the UN climate body have said that if we want to reach the 2-degree scenario, which is in line with the Paris Agreement, we have to cut back down to something like 40 gigatons of emissions. So that's quite a dramatic fall. And we haven't seen those levels of emissions since 1990. So it gives you a sense of the challenges that we have ahead. If we don't cut emissions and we continue as we are today on the way we live our lives today, estimates suggest that the world economy will rise to above 3 degrees in terms of global warming.
Right. So what do emissions look like in the mining industry specifically? I'm wondering which commodities produce the most emissions when they're extracted and also the least.
So in terms of the commodity industry, we know that there are some industries like cement, iron ore, and steel, which are highlighted as the highly pollutive industries. So they emit quite a lot of emissions. So to the order of 5 to 7% of global emissions comes from those industries. And then if you look at other industries such as copper and nickel, the emission levels are much lower.
Okay, so what are some ways that mining companies can reduce their emissions? What progress have we seen so far, and where is it coming from?
So if we think about the emissions at the moment in the mining industry, they come from a variety of sources. So a key one is the burning of fossil fuels in order to extract those materials. So the fuel usage is quite significant, and the type of fuel is quite significant as well. So if they rely on coal, they're going to have high sources of emissions. If they rely on hydro power, they will have a lower source of emissions. So it actually really depends on the asset and where it's located, what it can actually do. So if it is located near a renewable source of power, if it's in a sunny region or close to levels of water, it can get those power sources. But power generation is a key source of emissions for the mining industry. And you asked about what can they do. One of the easiest things they can do to reduce emissions is actually switch to a form of renewable power. I also want to stress, as I was saying before, that if you look across assets within a mine, say, for example, within aluminium, the aluminium industry, you see huge variations across assets. Some of them produce as low as 2 tons of carbon dioxide per unit of aluminium produced, and others will produce 20 units of carbon dioxide. So you can see there's a 10-fold difference in emission levels depending on sources of fuel that they use.
All of these factors are really part of a larger focus on ESG in the mining space. And you mentioned in your PDAC talk that the mining companies that are most likely to succeed over the next decade are the ones that are able to show that they're following ESG principles. So, how can mining companies do that? And what characteristics or points can a person look at in order to measure whether a company is doing a good job at ESG?
So ESG, those 3 letters, environmental, social, governance, are the characteristics where there's increased scrutiny right now. And obviously mining companies have been focusing on these types of concerns for decades, if not centuries, in some regions, where they've worked very closely with local communities to think about how the mining in the region affects the local communities and how they can give prosperity to that region. I guess what's different now in terms of the focus is that it's become a more worldwide demonstration, if you like. So it's not just the local community that you have to convince the people who buy your product, and not just the initial person you sell to, but the person that it ultimately goes down the whole supply chain to the consumer, because the consumer wants to look at a product and say, this has been made with ESG compliance throughout its value chain. And so the burden of proving ESG compliance is much bigger and much broader. And even if you think about the investment that goes into mining companies, the ultimate investor, which is in individuals, pensioners, it's their money, they are also putting restrictions on how they want their funds to be invested. And so they want to invest in sustainability. And that's why you get the pressure, which is kind of much broader. So how can mining companies do this? I'm afraid they have to work much harder, and I'm afraid they have to jump through more hoops. Data and data disclosure on emissions, on carbon footprint of a company and across the value chain is becoming increasingly important. So I think that's where the focus will have to be.
All right, thank you for that. Are there any final points you'd add on the topics we've covered?
So one final point that I do want to add is, if you think about fossil fuels, what are they? They are resources, plants, and ancient marine organisms that have been trapped in the earth or the oceans. And that's the energy that we have been using. So it's natural resources of the past, which we are using today as energy. And where we want to go to is by using, again, natural resources, the wind, the sun that we get, and the water that we have in the future. So we are still using the world's resources, but we're using the resources of the future rather than of the past.
But thank you so much for that overview. It was great to have you. Once again, I'm Charlotte McLeod with the Investing News Network, and this is Jumana Saleheen with CRU Group.